Greetings, educators. My name is Janelle Mercado. I am a program support specialist for the Supporting Inclusive Practices project. We are a project funded by the California Department of Education, focused on providing tiered technical assistance to local education agencies. Our focus is to improve outcomes for students with disabilities in general education settings. It is an honor to have the opportunity to do this series of professional learning experiences on UDL on behalf of our team. It is the intent of this UDL web module series to deepen understanding of the UDL framework and thus increase access and outcomes for our most marginalized student populations. To contact our team or access additional resources, you are welcome to reach us through Twitter or Facebook at SIP Inclusion or at our website at sipinclusion.org. Now let's get started. I would like to provide you with an overview of the 3 modules in this webinar series. Currently, you are viewing Module 1, Celebrating the Variability of All Learners. In Module 2, you will learn about utilizing the UDL framework to develop expert learners. And in Module 3, you will learn about mitigating barriers to access and equity through lesson design. To accompany this web module series, we have created a Padlet wall, which is a bulletin board of resources that can be accessed by participants to deepen their knowledge of universal design for learning. The Padlet wall can be accessed at padlet.com/sip_grant/UDL webinar series, which is the link located on the screen. You can also take a picture of the QR code that is located on the screen to access the Padlet wall. All of the resources referenced throughout this webinar series, along with the recording for each web module, PowerPoint presentation, and processing guide, which is shown on the screen, can also be found on the Padlet. The processing guide is a space for participants to take notes and respond to discussion prompts throughout the web module. The icon of a piece of paper shown on the screen will appear on each slide that has a corresponding space to jot down notes on your processing guide. You are also welcome to utilize any other tools that will support your learning with or in place of the processing guide. We want you to have choices. To orient you to the Padlet wall, I want to point out that on the left-hand side of the page, in the first column, you will find module number 1 with the recording of this web module and all of the resources for today's session. You can download the PowerPoint processing guide and any other resources you would like. In the second column, you will find additional resources that align with the topic of celebrating the variability of learners. To download any of the materials, click on the icon. When you download the PowerPoint presentation, you will see an error message that says file too large. Go ahead and download anyway. At this time, please pause the recording and access any of the materials and resources you may need to support your learning. In module number 1, educators will understand the connections between learner variability, intersectionality, and the cycle of failure. Educators will also recognize the impact of the Industrial Revolution model of education and current workforce expectations. And lastly, educators will develop an awareness of the UDL framework and vocabulary. So when we look at equity and equality in education, a few things come to the surface. In many cases, our educational system looks at students and outcomes from an equality perspective, that everyone gets the same, that every student learns the same, yet in reality, our outcomes are not the same. In an equal educational system, everyone has the same opportunities, like every student receiving the exact same assignment with the same materials, with the same instruction, etc. However, not every student approaches this educational system in the same way. So therein lies inequities in an equal educational system. However, in an equitable educational system, it is based on everyone getting what they need, which might be different for each student, but the outcomes means every student getting the opportunity to access their education and benefit from their education. You will notice that the note-taking icon is located on the top right-hand side of the screen. We have two questions. First, in what ways does an equality perspective create barriers to learning? Secondly, in what ways does an equity perspective promote individual learning differences? Go ahead and pause the recording to take a few moments to answer those two questions on your processing guide or anywhere else that you would like to record your response. As noted in California Education Code, the purpose of the educational system is that each child is a unique person with unique needs, and the purpose of the educational system of this state is to enable each child to develop all of his or her own potential. A means of ensuring each child in our state has opportunities to equitable educational experiences that will allow each student to reach their potential, we turn to UDL, designed by CAST, to guide the development of curricula that is flexible and supportive. Universally designed structures are indeed more usable by individuals with disabilities, but in addition, they offer unforeseen benefits for all. On your processing guide, there are a few more statements that describe the UDL framework. UDL is not a curriculum or a toolbox. It is a mindset for all learners. UDL is a proactive lesson planning framework that identifies potential barriers to learning. Right now, as we shift to distance learning, we are seeing bigger barriers than ever before. So as we transition to online learning, we want to lean into the UDL framework more than ever to make learning more accessible for every student. UDL is not a framework specific to supporting students with disabilities, but it is a framework to design learning for all. There is a common UDL saying, what is necessary for some is good for all. UDL is a universal Tier 1 level of support across all educational settings that takes into account the variability of learners in all settings. Later in this module, we will walk through the components of the UDL guidelines, which you'll see on the screen here. But should you be interested in accessing more information about the UDL guidelines, you can go to udlguidelines.cast.org, which you can also find the link to on your processing guide. Throughout this module, we will also introduce key UDL vocabulary. In your processing guide, there is a space to jot down definitions, thoughts, or questions that come up for you as we introduce each key piece of vocabulary. We are going to review learner variability as it relates to intersectionality and identity development, principles, guidelines, checkpoints, engagement, representation, action, and expression. Let's begin by talking about learner variability. Learner variability changes within contexts, environment, level of expertise, interests, and so much more. The definition of learner variability from UDL Theory and Practice, which is linked on the Padlet, is experience and common sense suggests that all individuals are unique and learn in ways that are, to varying degrees, particular to them. And in the past quarter century, science has elucidated the great variability of the human capacity to learn. Yet, our educational system is designed around the idea that most people learn the same way, and that a fair education is an identical one. On your processing guide, we have posed a few questions for you to answer. Which aspect or aspects of the quote above resonated with you? Would you agree that our educational system is designed around a one-size-fits-all model? Why is our education system designed around the idea that most people learn the same way? This dates back to the Industrial Revolution. Do you notice any similarities or differences in the images on the slide? These are pictures of factories and school settings during the early 1900s. As you can see, on the left-hand side, we were preparing students to become factory workers, where they were expected to have basic skills to complete rote tasks and follow directions. Folks at the time were competing for the same jobs in factories. Our classrooms mirrored this. As you can see by the image on the right side, Students were taught using the same curriculum, everyone was expected to learn the same way, and everyone should benefit from those same opportunities. That was the thought, at least. The typical teaching methods heavily relied on printed text and lecture. If students were lucky, the text was read out loud to them. In many ways, classrooms today and instruction still rely heavily on similar teaching methods that are very text-based and lecture-heavy. On your processing guide, consider the question: has the Industrial Revolution design of our education system changed to reflect current trends in workforce expectations? Needs have changed in the 21st century. If we continue to educate children in the public school system the way that we always have, we will continue to produce the same results. Only those that are meant to learn the same will benefit. Instead, we need to educate our students through the lens of universal design for learning as a foundation for inclusive practices. We want to foster inquiry, innovation, honor and celebrate the variability of learners that come to us, remove barriers, and allow students to be in the driver's seat of their own learning. If we want them to be self-directed, creative, problem solvers, reflective, engaged, hardworking, we have to provide them with opportunities so that they will be able to compete for jobs that don't yet exist. For more information about the history of our education system, you can read or listen to an audio version of the Factories of Education article located on the Padlet. Let's talk a little bit more about learner variability. When looking at the image on the screen, there is two men, very different body compositions. It's easy to predict and to be able to say that variability is a norm when we're talking about body composition. Every human has extreme differences in height, weight, reach, torso, shoulders, chest, waist, hips, legs. So it's pretty predictable. We know humans have very different body compositions. So the same is true when we look at individual differences in learning. Every person comes to the school setting with differences in their memory, their language, knowledge, reading, curiosity, vocabulary, perceptual skills, cognition, interests. However, there's a tendency to teach to this mythical average. Yet, there's plenty of research about learning that confirms there is no average learning profile. Much like the jagged physical profile we just discussed in the previous slide, individuals also have a jagged learning profile. So when we teach to the average, so many learners are left out. In your processing guide, we want you to take a few minutes to have an experience charting your own learning profile. Take some time to indicate where you would rate yourself in each category. On the left-hand side of the page, how would you self-rate on a scale from way low, low, average, high, or way high on your memory skills, language skills, knowledge, reading, vocabulary, curiosity? Go ahead and take a few minutes to do that now. When we are not sure what students can learn, presume competence and the ability to learn. Is it possible that our preconceived notions about people guide what we decide to teach and how learners will learn? Is it possible that our presumed competence impacts what we decide to teach and how learners will learn? We are preparing students today for careers that do not yet exist. We must presume competence that all students can and will. An example of this, I'd like to introduce you to Patrick and Beth Foraker. Beth is Patrick's mother. She's a supervisor at UC Davis in the School of Education. Patrick was born with Down syndrome. The both provided our team with a private interview telling their story, which has been uploaded onto the Padlet, and I highly recommend. Beth tells her story from the perspective of a parent who has experienced having a child with a disability that was marginalized from the moment her son was born. It began at birth when a note was placed on her hospital door, "No visitors." It was assumed by the hospital staff that Beth wouldn't want to have visitors. She also tells many stories about the struggle to ensure Patrick was fully included in school and community from elementary through high school. She also credits the wonderful educators and peers along the way that provided Patrick with the amazing inclusive opportunities that he received. She uses the quote, "Early segregation does not merely predict later segregation, it almost ensures it." So when we're looking at segregating students, we also have to keep in mind segregating students in the school system will also guarantee that they will be segregated once they leave our system. So this is Patrick today. This is actually a post that Beth provided on her social media. The picture shows Patrick walking down the concourse on his way to his second semester of his sophomore year in college. Patrick is attending a 4-year college, living independently in Virginia, studying to become a movie director. While Beth is thrilled that Patrick has had the opportunity to attend college, she is most moved by the fact that Patrick is experiencing a fully inclusive life, with friends, doing community activities like riding in an Uber or going to a football game, events that many in life might take for granted. Beth attests to the fact that being included from the very beginning has taught Patrick how to relate to his peers, understand adults, and himself, most importantly, in a variety of learning situations, which is why he's been so successful in living this independent life that he lives today. On your processing guide, we've listed a few questions. Take a moment to respond. What are your thoughts and reflections on the quote in the previous slide? Early segregation does not merely predict later segregation, it almost ensures it. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Why or why not? Also, predict what Patrick's life might be like if he had not been afforded inclusive opportunities. Where do you think he'd be today? Would he be able to go to college? Would he be able to hold a job? Would he be as self-determined as he is? So a couple more thoughts about learner variability. 2 things we know for sure. Learner variability is systematic and to a large degree predictable. There's never been a class of students that are all performing at the exact same academic, behavioral, developmental, social, emotional levels. So we can predict. We have students with jagged learner profiles that have a variability of learning, and we can plan for that. Also, learner capacity is context dependent. Context dependent meaning we're good at some things and better at other things. We may learn best in the morning. Others might learn best in the evening. For example, I'm not a math person. I have a lot to improve upon in this area. However, when it comes to language arts, I'm so much stronger. But there's still variation when it comes to things like reading a text. I comprehend stories that I am so much more interested in and I can relate to. But if you handed me a really boring, dense text, I'm much less likely to persist and push through in comprehending the story. So I have a teammate that often talks about how crummy he is at art skills. Yet, in the context of figure skating, he's an expert. It is with this typical jagged learning profile that students approach the educational system. We know our classrooms are filled with learner variability. So let's look into how we can presume competence and create inclusive learning opportunities for all of our learners that come our way. We are going to watch a quick video. This is Shelly Moore. She's amazing. If you use social media, you can follow her and receive updated videos like the one we're about to see. In your processing guide, there is a space for you to take notes and express your thoughts about the video.
Hi, my name is Shelly Moore, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. As Canadians, we have a reputation for finding and embracing the strength in our diversity. This value, however, hasn't been reflected in our classrooms, which still segregates students by ability, especially students with developmental disabilities. There's a gap in our understanding about what we know inclusive education to be, philosophically, versus what we understand and the importance of understanding inclusion in our practice. This is the question I'm trying to answer in my research, is how can we find the value in the day-to-day practice in our classrooms in terms of inclusive education? So how am I going to explain this to you? Now I can sit here and try and describe this, or we could have a little bit more fun. Why don't we go bowling? So let's talk about bowling. You have 10 pins, you have 2 balls, and you have a lane. The goal is to knock down as many pins as you can. But if you don't get them all, it's okay because you have another chance. But when I bowl and roll the ball down the middle and I don't knock them all down, what often ends up happening to me is that there's 2 pins left standing on either end and they stare at you. It's the 7-10 split and it's the hardest shot in bowling. How is bowling like teaching? The ball was the lesson, the pins are the kids. We aim for the middle, we do the best we can. The pins that are left standing, we often have another chance to kind of get to them, but at the end of the day, those 2 pins that are staring, looking at you, are kids who need the most support and are kids who need the most challenge. So we end up choosing one, and the other one is left standing. I just took all the fun out of bowling. Now, I don't know how many times you've watched professional bowling, but I spent an afternoon watching professional bowling, and let me tell you, there was not one bowler who rolled that ball down the middle of the lane. They throw the ball down the lane at a curve. And I was actually really curious about this, so I called up a professional bowler. He was so excited. I don't think he gets a lot of calls about education. He said the reason why the ball has to enter at a curve is because you will knock down more pins and create a bigger domino effect if you enter at that angle. But in order to do that, you have to change your aim. In order to knock down the most pins with one shot, he aims for the pins that are the hardest to hit. Now let's just let this sink in for a second. We are taught to teach the head pins. We are not taught to teach to the kids who are the furthest and the hardest to get to. The kids with autism, the kids with Down syndrome. The part that's critical here, and it really aligns with universal design for learning, is that so often the supports that we design for those kids on the outside of the lane are actually supports that all of the kids need. This is the part we need to understand if inclusive education is going to move forward in Canada. How can we find this value of diversity in our classrooms between the students? This is not just important for the outside pins, but it's critical for every single one of us. And just think, all we need to do is change our aim. Look how bowling changed education.
This video makes me think of Patrick and so many more of our students, being the 7 or the 10 pin. As we design our instruction and focus on those students that need the most support, we are most likely to reach all of our students. What benefits students on the margins also benefits those not on the margins. Let's look at learner variability through the lens of intersectionality. It's a term critical to understanding the various identities that students bring to the education system. Remember that your processing guide has a space for you to take notes on the key vocabulary terms as they are introduced. To begin the conversation about learner variability through the lens of intersectionality, we have to self-reflect on the idea that there are specific groups of people that are afforded privileges in our society and educational system that are not accessible or afforded to other groups. This requires a level of self-reflection and also shared responsibility. We are responsible for teaching all students beyond the silos of general education, special education, English learners, etc. All students are our students, and all students are general education students first. In your note-taking guide, we reference shared responsibility and self-reflection. What thoughts, emotions, and/or perspectives are raised based on the terms privilege, implicit bias, and marginalization? Take a moment and reflect. When we acknowledge that bias exists, we are then empowered to go deeper into the work of breaking down one baby step at a time. We can do this work by increasing our awareness of identity, which includes understanding of intersectionality. Conversations around privilege, power, and implicit bias begin with self-reflection of how our society works and that there are individuals, certain people that benefit from the way the world is structured. And then there are those who are marginalized because of these structures. We are going to take a moment to watch a short video on intersectionality. What is it and why is it important? Remember, there is a space in your processing guide to express your thoughts while watching the video.
Intersectionality. Have you heard this word before? Even if you have, you might not know what it means. Let's take a look at it. The first part's easy enough. Intersection, a place where things come together. Intersectionality refers to the reality that we all have multiple identities that intersect to make us who we are. It also gives us a way to talk about oppressions and privileges that overlap and reinforce each other. This term dates back to the 1980s and legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. She noticed that we didn't have an effective way to talk about how the experiences of Black women are different from the experiences of Black men and of white women. How? Black women endure both gender discrimination and racial discrimination. Over the last 30 years, scholars, educators, and activists have expanded the use of the word intersectionality to talk about identities beyond race and gender. Let's look at a few examples. Jerry has a disability, and his family lives below the poverty line. He is the oldest of 10, which requires him to do a lot of caregiving, and sometimes keeps him out of school. No one in the school counseling office has talked to Jerry or his parents about his plans for after graduation. He has applied for several jobs, but never gets called back. Fatima is Muslim and recently came to the United States from Somalia. She finds that many people at her school make assumptions about her values and abilities before they speak to her. Many of her classmates think she shouldn't be at their school at all. Greta comes from an affluent family. Both her parents and grandparents went to college, and her father owns a successful business. She doesn't think about her identity very often, but she does think of herself as someone who will go to college and get a good job once she graduates. Think about Greta's situation as opposed to Fatima's or Jerry's. Fatima and Jerry are members of marginalized groups. They don't get to choose whether or not to think about their identities. Greta, on the other hand, can ignore intersectionality if she wants to. Life isn't the same for everyone, even for people who share identity characteristics. By adopting an intersectional lens, we have a better opportunity to understand why and to change the institutions that help and harm us based on who we are. Want to learn more? Read our story, Teaching at the Intersections, in the summer 2016 issue of Teaching Tolerance magazine.
As we look at intersectionality a little more deeply, we look at various identities students bring to the education setting. The circle on the screen represents the student. The students each bring with them many different identities: national origin, ethnicity, sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, economic status, zip code, race, age, language, disability. And all the identities interact in a way that creates significant variability within each student and the way that they approach the education system, peers, adults, supervision, direction, etc. Each of the identities and the way they interact with one another also influence the perspective of the adults within that system. Specifically looking at students with disabilities, when a student qualifies for an IEP or education services, something interesting happens with the other identities. Generally, all of the other identities fall away, and that student is labeled based on one identity. They're labeled as a student with a disability. It is believed that there are 6 different approaches to various identities. We can approach others from either a place of repulsion and fear, where identity is seen as a crime against nature. We can come from a place of pity, feeling sorry for the other person or for their identities. We can come from a space of neutrality and ambivalence, not having a repulsion, fear, or pity, but instead taking the stance of, I don't really know or understand that identity, and it doesn't affect me. So I'll just carry on treating everyone the same. We can approach different identities from a place of acceptance, respecting and celebrating differences and diversity. We may come from a place of admiration, recognizing that being any of the particular identities and their intersection requires strength. This requires the willingness to examine ourselves and our biases at a deeper level. Or lastly, we can be an ally, meaning we understand that the work to identify our own oppressive attitudes, beliefs, behaviors is never done. It's a lifelong journey, and we become the ally for those students who have different identities than we possess. We then advocate for those students who may typically be marginalized. The previous slide and this slide include definitions and examples for the different ways to approach identities. On your processing guide, there is an activity that we would encourage you to do. You will see the intersection of identities slide, and then there's a space for you to list 10 of your students' individual identities. From there, you will take some time to review each of the different approaches to identities. Then self-reflect on your immediate responses to each of those identities. Are you approaching that identity from a space of repulsion, fear, pity, neutrality, acceptance, admiration, or as an ally? It is once we are able to self-reflect and identify our approach to different identities that we can then interrupt our bias. We have to understand that we're human. Our brains have evolved to take shortcuts. We can interrupt our subconscious beliefs and shift our impact to align more closely to our intentions as educators by 1, observing ourselves, taking note of our instinctual observations and thoughts about others' identities that are different from our own. We can also reflect on identities as we're doing now. We can broaden our cultural experiences and knowledge of others, grounding ourselves in a definition of equity, and most importantly, leaning into the work. As previously mentioned, this is a lifelong journey. In addition to recognizing our human approach to student identities, we also need to examine our beliefs and expectations for our students. Bigotry is sometimes a buzzword. In this case, it's not meant to be a negative perspective. In the video created by Beth Forker, referenced earlier and located on the Padlet, she mentions the idea of soft bigotry of low expectations. She describes an experience she had after her son Patrick was born. In the hospital, the La Leche support person told her that since her son was born with Down syndrome, she didn't need to worry about breastfeeding because it would be too difficult. Later in life, Beth learned that children with Down syndrome have enlarged tongue, and breastfeeding would actually exercise their tongue and improve the motor movements needed to develop communication skills. That was soft bigotry of low expectations. Having low expectations or approaching individuals from a perspective of they won't be able to do it. It impacts the cycle of failure. Commonly what happens when we have a deficit view of students is that we lower the expectations for them. Then we label them and provide them with remedial coursework or place them in programs that often perpetuate low expectations. And thus, the student experiences marginalization. In your processing guide, we've included a few questions around the cycle of failure. What does the soft bigotry of low expectations mean to you as an educator? Have you experienced it? Have you experienced the cycle of failure in education or in your own work? And then, can you brainstorm ways the cycle of failure can be broken? Take a moment to self-reflect on those questions. We've discussed the importance of looking at learner variability through the lens of intersectionality. We know that all of our students come to us with unique identities, needs, strengths, and gifts. Our approach needs to come from a space of shared responsibility and self-reflection, where we provide students opportunities to be the unique humans they are and celebrate that. In order to learn who our students are, we can provide them with opportunities to use their voice. Our teammates attended the Equity Institute at Riverside County Office of Education, and one of the presentations had a student panel. This panel was made up of 20 students from all walks of life, all races, gender, ability, disability, and sexual orientation. They were asked the question, if you could say one thing to educators, what would it be? On the screen, I'm going to pull up the exact words that they said. How you label me is how you treat me. Reach the whole by starting with the one. Try to step down and relate to your students. Try to find out why. Instead of judging, ask a question and try to understand. Check your biases at the door. If you give up on one student, you give up on being an educator. Do you see yourself or your children succeeding in the system you are in charge of orchestrating? Take our advice. The only wrong step is to not do anything. Be more considerate and understanding. Make a safe place. Let students know they are seen, they are heard, and they are valid. You never know what's going on with a student outside of school. Don't make assumptions. We are not the same. We are all different and have to be taught differently. Make school a second home because it sometimes is the only home a student has. It was incredibly powerful to have 1,200 people in one room, not a dry eye in the house, but also self-reflecting on what these students have experienced, how they've been marginalized, and thinking about ways to improve and ensure that the educational system does not continue to marginalize students. The wise words of Nelson Mandela. The world's problems begin with the belief that some humans' lives are more valuable than others. It forces me to think, who is valued in our education system and who is less valued? We are going to begin introducing you to the Universal Design for Learning guidelines. And to do that, we're going to watch a video. This is the Signs Restaurant. It is a restaurant staffed with all deaf servers. When you watch this video, I'd like you to compare and contrast the environment of the restaurant with teaching and learning. Think about the education setting. There's a space in your processing guide to take notes.
A unique dining experience has just reached Canada. You can find it at a restaurant in downtown Toronto. It's different because the menu not only caters to the taste buds, it also speaks a language of food you won't hear anywhere else. Joanna Remiliotis explains.
The menus are ready, the sliders ready to grill, the staff dressed and ready to go. Opening night of a brand new restaurant in town, where the goal of the evening is to have your order fall on deaf ears. Yep, you heard that right.
This is Canada's first restaurant staffed with deaf waiters and waitresses.
But in terms of an idea, how...
This is the first one of its kind.
Aptly named Signs, this is a place where you have to follow the signs. Customers are asked to order food and drink using American Sign Language. There are icons next to every menu item and a cheat sheet to help.
Oh yeah, red something and then beet and then watermelon.
And what does that mean?
Red beet watermelon salad.
I think I'm gonna have the duck.
What's that? Sign it.
Duck.
Yeah, you're gonna have to sign that.
I think it's like this and like this.
Exciting.
And Jan Manikumar wanted to deliver a whole new dining experience and give deaf people a chance to shine.
Providing them an opportunity here, I think, is something that they deserve, and they are very talented. Every one of them, every one of my staff, I'm very happy to say they are extremely talented.
More than 200 deaf people apply to work here. Most of the 50 or so who made the cut have no restaurant experience, but a passion to learn.
Giving the deaf community opportunity to work in a workforce that they wouldn't otherwise be able to work in. And it's opening up a whole new workforce for the deaf community.
This is Mehdi Safavi's first full-time job. An interpreter helped us ask him how that feels.
It's wonderful. I'm so excited to be here. It's a deaf environment where hearing people can come in and experience our world and our culture. So it's really amazing, really amazing. And it's a challenge for me, but a great challenge.
It's brand new, but already there's a buzz and reservations are pouring in.
Your biggest problem right now is that you have too much business?
I might have too much.
And all through an entirely different word of mouth. Joanna Bermiliotis, CBC News, Toronto.
Were you able to find any similarities or differences between the restaurant and the education setting we teach in? It makes me think about how the restaurant environment was set up in a way that removed barriers so that the servers could do their job. For example, take the server who said that this was his first job. One of the barriers that was removed was a language barrier. Now that he was able to communicate with patrons, he could demonstrate that he had the skills all along to be a server, but he had never been given the access to an environment that allowed him to demonstrate that. It makes me think, is it the person that's disabled, or is it the environment that is creating disabling conditions? Then, thinking of it from the patron's perspective, by virtue of stepping into the restaurant, their primary mode of language changed. The goal was for them to order a meal, and for them to reach that goal, the language barrier needed to be removed. They were provided some visual supports, given the opportunity to struggle through it a bit, and what do you know? They did it. They ordered the food using sign language. Much like our students, if the goal is to meet the lesson objective, then we need to ensure the environment is set up in a way that removes the barriers to their learning. We know our students come to us with a wide variability of strengths and complex needs, and that a one-size-fits-all approach creates inequities. So how do we create environments that remove barriers for students and foster their ability to do their best? We look at the Universal Design for Learning Guidelines as a place to start. We're going to end Module number 1 by orienting you to the UDL guidelines, and in Module 2, we are going to take a deeper dive. As a reminder, your processing guide has a space for you to reflect on the meaning of each vocabulary term. The UDL guidelines were created based on brain research that has provided educators with a lot of information about what the brain needs to learn. The brain is an intricate system, and using the information about how it works, the UDL guidelines are structured around 3 principles. Each one is intended to activate different areas of the brain. The principles for educators are to provide students with multiple means or ways of engagement, representation, and action and expression. The 3 principles were designed with guidelines for educators to use. There are 9 guidelines that are intended to light up different areas of the brain. The 9 guidelines are recruiting interest, sustaining effort and persistence, self-regulation, perception, language and symbols, comprehension, physical action, expression and communication, and executive functioning. Within each guideline, there are checkpoints for educators. The checkpoints provide educators with more detailed information about how to light up the different areas of the brain. These are also all of the different ways we can remove barriers for students and create learning environments that are more accessible for everyone. The goal is that we use the principles of multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression to create expert learners. We want every student to be purposeful and motivated, students that have the persistence to work through challenging situations and believe in themselves. Know that they have the ability to be resourceful and knowledgeable, believe that they can solve problems. Lastly, we want our students to be strategic and goal-directed, independent and self-directed. As previously mentioned, in Module 2, we will take a closer look into how we can use the UDL guidelines to remove learning barriers and create expert learners. We'd like to leave you with this final quote. Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better, by Maya Angelou. Thank you so much for your commitment to this work. We are all in this journey to continuously improve and do better. There is a space in your processing guide to note Based on what you learned today, what are 2 areas that you want to commit to doing better? Thank you very much for your time today. We would love your feedback, so if you could take a few moments to complete the short survey that we've created for this web module. You can access the survey by clicking on the link located on the PowerPoint slide here, or using the QR code, or you can type in the link www.surveymonkey.com/r/2PZWP68. Have a great day.